I never thought that a regular business assignment could change my life so drastically. It all started with a single glance, a single decision, a single meeting that turned everything upside down. I was confident in myself, in my abilities, in my capacity to manage my career and life. But as it turned out, sometimes fate has its own plans, and you don't even notice when you find yourself at the center of events from which there is no turning back. The workday was coming to an end, and only those who were staying late for a meeting remained in the office. I sat at my desk, absently flipping through the pages of my sketches for a new project when I heard someone say my name. Amanda Jennings. The voice of the department head sounded like a clap of thunder on a clear day. I looked up and met the gaze of Richard Hughes, our boss. He rarely attended such meetings, usually delegating these matters to his deputies. But today he had come himself and seemed to want to discuss something. "Yes, Mr. Hughes," I replied, trying not to reveal my nervousness. My inner voice was screaming, "This is your chance!" Richard looked serious, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. He glanced around the room and then focused back on me. "We have a new project," he began, and there was a deep tone in his voice that made you listen instinctively. "A major client who demands unconventional solutions, and I believe you are the person who can handle this." I nodded, trying to stay calm, although my heart was beating faster than usual. This was my opportunity, a chance to prove what I was capable of. Richard continued, leaning slightly toward the table. "I've seen your work, Amanda. There's something special in it. You have a talent for noticing details, finding new approaches. That's why I want you to curate this project." At that moment, I felt my heart skip a beat. The boss himself acknowledged my talents and was now entrusting me with one of the most significant projects. I couldn't miss such an opportunity. "Thank you, Mr. Hughes," I said, struggling to hide a smile. "It's a great honor for me. I will do everything I can to live up to your trust." "I have no doubt about that," he replied with a slight smile, in which a barely perceptible spark of interest flashed. The meeting continued, but I could no longer focus on the general discussions. My thoughts were occupied with the upcoming project, its scale, and the opportunities it opened up for me. And Richard's gaze, which had been fixed on me just a moment ago. After the meeting, Richard invited me to his office to discuss the project's details. I tried to appear composed and confident, even though I felt a storm raging inside. The boss's office was spacious and bright, with large windows through which the soft evening light streamed. Richard pointed to a chair across from his desk, and I sat down, trying not to show my nervousness. "So, Amanda," he began, pushing aside a few folders with documents. "This project is very important for us. The client requires a non-standard approach. I am confident you can offer something truly unique." I nodded, catching his gaze. In his eyes, there was something more than just professional interest. He continued speaking, but I sensed a slight tension in his voice, as if he, too, felt that something was happening between us, something that didn't fit within the boundaries of ordinary professional relationships. We discussed the concept, details, and budgets for a long time, but at some point, the conversation became less formal. Richard leaned back in his chair, and his voice softened. "You know, Amanda," he said, leaning slightly closer, "I like your energy and approach. You're not afraid to take risks, and that is a rare quality." "Thank you," I replied, feeling my heart start to beat faster. We fell silent, and for a few seconds, a tension hung in the room. At that moment, I realized that our relationship might go beyond work. In his eyes, I saw something more: interest, admiration, and perhaps something that we both had yet to understand. I looked at him, and in that instant, it became clear to me that what lay ahead was far more complex than just business meetings and discussions. The project completely consumed me. I began spending more and more time in Richard's office. Sometimes it felt like the project had a life of its own, pulling both of us into its whirlwind. The evenings stretched longer, and the office lights stayed on, illuminating our lively discussions. Amanda, I love your vision, Richard would say as we reviewed the latest sketches. You have something that can't be put into words: confidence, boldness, and something else that I want to get to know better. His voice always sounded soft, but there was something in it that made me listen more intently to every word. We spent hours discussing the project, sometimes forgetting that it was already dark outside. Our conversations grew more candid. Were you always this driven? I asked one evening, not taking my eyes off his confident smile. Richard laughed and leaned back in his chair. Driven? I don't know, he replied, shrugging slightly. But I've always known what I wanted. And right now, I want to make this project the best we've ever done. His confidence both amazed and attracted me. He was someone who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to take risks to get it. And I seemed to be becoming more and more fascinated by this new world he was revealing to me. One evening, when we were once again staying late in the office, discussing details and revisions, Richard suggested, "How about we have some coffee? The coffee here in the office is terrible, but there's a cozy cafe not far from here. We'll just make it before it closes." I felt my heart start to beat faster. It was an innocent gesture, a simple suggestion, but his eyes spoke of something else. In them, I saw not just the exhaustion after a long workday, but also curiosity, interest, something more than just professional admiration. Yes, why not? I smiled, agreeing. We went to a small cafe nearby. The atmosphere was warm and cozy, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, inviting us to relax. We sat at a small table by the window, and Richard seemed to shed all his work demeanor. "Tell me about yourself, Amanda," he said unexpectedly. "Who are you when you're not working?" I paused for a moment, then began talking about my life outside the office. He listened intently, rarely interrupting, only occasionally asking questions. At some point, I realized that I was beginning to open up to him more than I had planned. His interest was genuine, and that drew me in. When it was his turn to share stories, he talked about his childhood, his first steps in business, and how difficult it had been to build what he now had. His words carried a sense of pride, but not arrogance, just confidence in himself and his decisions. "You know," he said, leaning a little closer, "I think we have a lot in common, Amanda. We both aren't afraid to challenge ourselves and the world around us. And that is attractive." I felt my cheeks begin to burn. His words were simple, but there was a sincerity in them that made me feel slightly uneasy. Our eyes met, and I realized that something more than just a project was growing between us. That evening, I understood that we were beginning to dive deeper, not only into the details of the project, but also into our feelings for each other. And perhaps, this was just the beginning of what lay ahead for us. The days flew by quickly, filled with work on the project. But with each passing day, I increasingly felt the tension growing between Richard and me. He was not just my boss. He was someone who understood me, supported my ideas, and motivated me to strive for more. I was becoming more and more attracted to his confidence, his ability to achieve his goals, his athletic build, and the style with which he approached every task. But I sensed that this wasn't just admiration, it was something more. We both understood that our relationship had ceased to be purely professional. Sometimes our glances lingered a bit longer than they should have, or our conversations drifted into areas unrelated to work. All of this created a feeling of something inevitable, something that defied logic and reason. It was late in the evening. We were the only ones left in the office, discussing the final adjustments to the project. Richard stood by the table, examining the drawings, while I sat next to him, running through a mental list of things that still needed to be done. At some point, he turned to me and said with a smile, "You are truly an extraordinary person, Amanda. With such talent and determination, you could move mountains." I smiled, slightly embarrassed, but tried not to show it. "Thank you, Richard," I replied softly. But none of this would have been possible without your support and belief in me. He took a step closer and gently placed his hand on mine. The gesture was unexpected, yet it felt so natural. I looked into his eyes and saw something more than just respect or professional interest. You know, he said quietly, since we started working together, I often think about how grateful I am to fate for bringing us together. His fingers gently squeezed my hand, and I felt my heart skip a beat. This moment was pivotal. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't resist the attraction I felt. Richard, I began, but didn't have time to finish. He leaned in gently, and I felt his breath on my lips. For a second, the world seemed to stop, and in the next moment, our lips met. It wasn't a long or passionate kiss, but rather a tentative touch, a cautious step into the unknown. But there was so much emotion, so many suppressed desires in it, that I found it hard to breathe. We pulled away, as if realizing that we had crossed a line that could not be erased. I looked into his eyes and saw a reflection of my own thoughts. This changed everything. We both knew that we could no longer simply return to our usual working relationship. I'm sorry, he whispered, but there was neither regret nor remorse in his voice. Don't be, I replied, trying not to reveal my confusion. We both knew this could happen. We parted in silence, each with new thoughts and feelings. I went home, feeling the storm of emotions raging inside me. I knew this was the first step toward something that would change everything between us. After that first kiss, my relationship with Richard began to change even faster than I could have imagined. We continued working on the project, but every glance, every accidental touch carried a hidden meaning, as if an invisible bond had formed between us, one that could not be broken. In the office, everything remained the same. The usual hustle of employees, the sounds of phones ringing, the rustle of papers, and the soft hum of conversations in the neighboring rooms. But for me, everything had changed. Now, every time Richard entered the room, I felt the air around us grow thicker, as if it were filled with our shared secret, one that no one should ever discover. His presence became almost unbearable, not because I wanted to leave, but because I realized it was becoming harder and harder to control my feelings. Every morning, I told myself that it was just work, that I had to stay professional, keep my distance, and not let my emotions take over. But that was easier said than done. When our eyes met, I saw the same desire in his that I felt inside me. I tried to focus on the documents, the drawings, the concepts, but my thoughts kept returning to that moment when his lips touched mine. On the other hand, I started to feel guilt towards my husband. Every evening when I came home, I saw his tired but still loving smile, his calmness and trust, and it tore me apart. I kept asking myself, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? But there was no answer. It seemed as if I had lost control over myself, and I was drawn to Richard like a magnet. Meanwhile, Richard tried to maintain a professional distance, though there was the same fire burning in his eyes. He approached me with the same calmness he always showed his employees, but now there was a new note in his voice, a note of tenderness and curiosity. Sometimes, he would hold my gaze for a long time, as if studying every emotion that flickered across my face, and I felt warmth spreading inside me, mixed with anxiety. One of those tense days, when the project was particularly challenging, ended with both of us staying at the office later than usual. The rest of the staff had long gone home, and only our shadows danced on the walls under the lamplight. I stood by the window, looking at the lights of the evening city, feeling my heart beat faster when I heard his voice. Amanda, he began quietly, coming closer. How about we take a break from work? Let's have dinner. Not in this office, of course. There's a place that serves the best steak in the city. I turned around and saw his gaze. There was an invitation in it that I had both been waiting for and dreading. This dinner was not just a simple dinner, and we both knew it. I felt my palms sweat, and for a moment, I wondered if I should agree. but deep down, I had already made my decision. All right, I replied with a slight smile, trying to look confident, though inside I was boiling. Let's do it. Richard smiled and nodded slightly, as if confirming the rightness of our choice. We left the office, and with every step we took closer to the restaurant, the tension grew. The evening was cool, the streets were empty, and the headlights of passing cars seemed almost hypnotic. I knew that this dinner would change everything. It was a step into the unknown, and despite all my doubts, I was ready to take it. When we entered the restaurant, I immediately felt the dim light and the scent of fresh flowers envelop us. The room was filled with a soft glow from the candles, creating a cozy, almost intimate atmosphere. A gentle jazz melody flowed from the speakers, filling the space with warmth and calm. But inside me, emotions and doubts were still churning. Richard chose a table in the far corner of the room, away from the other guests. His presence attracted me, just as it had before. But now, in this dim light, it seemed that there was some invisible line between us that we were about to cross. He was confident, his gaze as perceptive as ever, but now with a barely noticeable softness. We started with polite conversation about work, discussing project details, but soon the talk shifted to more personal topics. Every word, every movement seemed more significant. We were no longer just talking. We were beginning to share things that usually remained outside the bounds of official conversations. Amanda, Richard suddenly said, leaning back in his chair and looking at me closely. Don't you think that sometimes life lacks courage? To throw everything away and just follow your desires, your dreams? I froze, surprised by his frankness. The question came unexpectedly, but I felt something inside me respond to his words. Yes, I admitted, looking up. Sometimes it feels like I'm not living my own life, as if all my dreams were left in the past, and now I'm just playing a role that others expect of me. Richard smiled slightly, as if pleased with my openness. He leaned in closer, his face illuminated by the soft candlelight. Tell me about your dreams, he said quietly. What are they? I fell silent, feeling a slight embarrassment, but his gaze was so attentive, almost caring, that I dared to speak. I always wanted to travel, to see the world, I said. I dreamed of visiting small towns in Italy, walking the narrow streets of Paris, drinking wine with a view of the sea in Spain. But life had other plans. Why didn't you do it? He asked, not taking his eyes off me. Maybe I was just scared, or I got used to stability. Sometimes I feel like I chose a quiet life too early instead of following my desires. I felt a lump in my throat and quickly took a sip of water to hide my emotions. Richard nodded thoughtfully, then shared his own. I also have dreams that have yet to be fulfilled, he said with unexpected sincerity. I've always wanted to create something of my own business, something meaningful that would leave a mark. But I, too, chose a different path, and now I feel like I've missed something important. Our conversations became more and more personal, and I felt an emotional pull between us, not just a physical one. We looked at each other, studying every nuance, every emotion that flickered across each other's face. It seemed as if the whole world outside this small table had disappeared, leaving just the two of us in this quiet, dimly lit corner. After dinner, Richard offered to walk me to my car. The air was cool, and I wrapped myself in my coat, feeling the cold air invigorate me, but my thoughts were far from the evening city. We walked in silence, and the tension between us began to build again. At some point, he stopped and turned to me. Amanda, he said softly, looking into my eyes. I don't know where this is going, but I can't stop thinking about you. I felt my heart beat faster, and the air became thick and heavy. I looked at him, realizing that at that moment, my desires and fears were clashing. Me too, I whispered before I could think. Richard stepped closer to me, his hands gently touching my shoulders, and at that moment, I realized that resisting was pointless. Our lips met again, but this time it was not a timid kiss. It was passionate, filled with the awareness that we had gone too far. I felt his fingers glide over my skin, and everything inside me turned upside down. When we pulled away, I realized I could no longer hide behind a professional mask. Something had changed forever. I returned to my car, and Richard stood watching me. The drive home felt long and heavy. Emotions were boiling inside me, and I realized that this evening had become a turning point. I had gone too far, and there was no turning back. The day after the dinner, I entered the office with a slight unease, still feeling the shadows of the previous night. Richard and I tried to behave professionally, but the glances we exchanged were enough to ignite a flame inside me that would not die down. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to his words, to his touch. Shortly after lunch, he approached me, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I have a suggestion for you," he said, smiling as if we were discussing some secret. "How about a weekend in the mountains?" My heart started beating faster. I didn't immediately understand what he meant and looked at him questioningly. "In the mountains?" I asked, feeling my cheeks begin to flush. "Why?" "We need a change of scenery," he continued, sitting on the edge of my desk. I thought it would be a great opportunity to spend some time together, away from all this work, and just relax. I hesitated. On one hand, the idea seemed tempting, spending time away from the city, from the hustle and bustle, from everything that reminded us of our work. But on the other hand, I felt a growing sense of guilt toward my husband. It seemed that every step away from the usual rhythm of life was plunging me deeper into the unknown. But my inner voice kept telling me that I had long deserved a break, a little time for myself. "I'm not sure it's a good idea," I said quietly, trying to keep my tone even. "Amanda," Richard spoke softly but confidently, "we've already crossed a certain line. I understand it's not easy for you to make this decision. But if you want to be at least a little honest with yourself, say yes." I looked at him, trying to read something in his eyes, and in that moment, I realized that maybe he was right. I was afraid to admit my true desires, afraid to see myself in a way I had never seen before. "All right," I exhaled, taking a step into the unknown. "I agree." I told my husband that I was going on a business trip, and we left for the mountains the next morning. The whole way there, I felt like I was in a fog, constantly thinking about what I was doing. The mountains grew closer, and the air became cleaner and cooler. I tried to reassure myself, thinking it was just a small trip, that I could control everything. But deep down, I knew I had long since lost control. When we reached our destination, I saw a small but cozy cottage at the foot of the mountain. Everything around was bathed in bright sunlight, and the place looked like something out of a fairy tale, peaceful, secluded, surrounded by greenery and birds, whose melodies filled the air with a harmonious chirping. "How do you like it?" Richard asked, smiling. "It's beautiful," I replied, feeling my heart finally slow down a bit. Richard suggested we spend the day outdoors, and I didn't object. We took our backpacks and set out on a small hike along trails that led deeper into the mountains. The sun's rays gently touched our faces, and the wind refreshed us, carrying the scent of pine and blooming meadows. "When I was a child," he began as we climbed a small hill with a view of the valley, "my parents often brought me here. I always felt free here, as if all the problems and worries were far away." I smiled, listening to him. I began to understand that this place was not just a choice for a getaway. It was meaningful. Here, he was himself, without all the roles we had to play in life. "It's a beautiful place," I agreed. "I see why you like it so much." We continued along the path, enjoying the quiet and our conversation. As the sun began to set, Richard suggested we have a small picnic on the hillside. We sat on the soft grass, unpacked the food we had brought, and simply remained silent, watching the sunset paint the sky in all shades of pink and orange. At some point, Richard turned to me and quietly said, "You know, Amanda, Sometimes I think these moments are what life is all about. I felt warmth spreading in my chest, as if his words touched the very depth of my soul. I didn't answer. I just nodded, and we sat there, savoring this moment as if it was meant to last forever. In the evening, when we returned to the cottage, Richard suggested lighting a fire in the fireplace. We sat on the floor, surrounded by soft blankets, listening to the crackling of the wood. The firelight reflected in his eyes, and in that light, I saw something new, something I hadn't noticed before, or hadn't wanted to notice. "Thank you for agreeing to come," he said, leaning in slightly closer. "I'm glad you're here." "I'm glad too," I replied, feeling my fingers unconsciously reaching for his hand. His hand found mine, and we sat like that in silence, realizing that this first day in the mountains had become the beginning of something more than just a short trip. The next morning, when the first rays of the sun touched the mountain peaks, I woke up to the sound of dew dripping outside the window. Richard was already up, warming water for coffee on an old stove in the corner of the room. His face was lit with a smile, and I immediately felt that this day would be special. "Good morning," he said softly, noticing that I was awake. "I thought we could spend the day a little differently today." I approached the window and saw the sun gilding the peaks and slopes of the mountains, as if the whole world were waking up just for us. I nodded in response, feeling a lightness in my soul and an anticipation of what lay ahead. Richard suggested we descend to a small village nestled at the foot of the mountains. We got into the car and slowly drove down the winding road, enjoying the views unfolding before us. The old houses, with roofs covered in tiles, were immersed in the greenery of the gardens. We stopped at a local market, where we met smiling farmers selling fresh fruits and vegetables. Their simplicity and kindness were a pleasant contrast to our usual city pace of life. We wandered through the market, tasting fresh berries, buying some cheese and homemade bread. The vendors shared stories about their families and traditions, and I felt my heart fill with warmth and gratitude for this day, for this opportunity to be here. After strolling through the village, Richard suggested we go to a lake nearby. The road there wound through a forest, and we walked on soft grass, enjoying the scent of freshness and the silence, occasionally broken only by birdsong. When we finally reached the lake's shore, I saw crystal clear water reflecting the blue sky and the greenery of the surrounding trees. Everything around seemed almost magical. "Let's go for a swim," Richard suggested, taking off his shirt and throwing it onto the grass. His face was glowing with joy, like a child anticipating a new mischief. I laughed, watching him, and then joined in. The water was cool and refreshing, and each dive filled me with energy. We splashed, laughed, and threw water at each other like children who had forgotten all their worries. After the swim, we lay on the grass to dry off, looking up at the sky. I felt the sun warming my skin, allowing myself to relax, feeling free from everything I had left behind in the city. Richard lay next to me, and there was something about his presence that made me feel alive. As the day began to draw to a close, we returned to our cottage, prepared a light dinner from everything we had bought at the market, and decided to spend the evening outside. The night was clear and quiet. The stars seemed to dance on the black velvet of the sky, illuminating it with countless lights. We spread a blanket on the grass and lay side by side, holding hands. "Look," Richard whispered softly, "at how many stars there are." I looked up and felt my heart swell with a sense of wonder and peace. We lay there in silence, enjoying the moment, feeling the emotions overwhelming both of us. It was like a scene from a movie, like a dream, and I realized that I didn't want to change anything anymore. Our hands intertwined more tightly, and I felt Richard move a little closer. His breathing became slightly faster, and I knew he felt the same as I did. Words were unnecessary. Our touches and glances said it all. This moment was perfect, and I didn't want it to end. But it didn't end. Richard gently rose and, looking into my eyes, suggested, "Shall we go inside? It's getting chilly, and I don't want you to catch a cold." I nodded, feeling the excitement building inside me. We slowly got up, and holding hands, we returned to the cottage. Inside, it was warm and cozy. The fire in the fireplace was still burning, casting a soft light and shadows on the walls. He came closer to me, touching my cheek with his fingertips, as if asking for permission. I looked into his eyes, and in that moment, everything became clear. I moved closer to him, and our lips met again. But this time, the kiss was filled with more confidence, more tenderness, and passion. Time seemed to stand still. Every step was dictated by a feeling that left no room for doubt. The night enveloped us, and all other thoughts disappeared. We were here and now, together, forgetting everything else in the world. When it was all over, we remained lying in each other's arms. I understood that this moment had become a part of me forever. We were silent, but it felt like we had said more to each other than we could ever express in words. Returning home turned out to be much more difficult than I could have anticipated. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The familiar road, the usual signs, the muffled noise of the city I knew by heart. But inside me, a storm was raging. After what happened in the mountains, my life suddenly took on new shapes. I felt different than before. It wasn't just my thoughts about Richard. It was also about how all of this had changed my perception of myself. When I entered the house, Jason was there, as usual. He was sitting at the kitchen table, immersed in a book, but I immediately noticed how he looked up when he heard the sound of the front door. His eyes lit up with joy that I could no longer share as I once did. I tried to smile to hide my inner turmoil, but I knew he had already sensed that something had changed. "Hi, darling." His voice was warm and welcoming, as always. "How was the business trip?" "Great," I replied shortly, taking off my coat and trying to sound as casual as possible. "I worked with colleagues, and we spent a little time together after work." He nodded, but I saw how his eyes studied my face. I avoided his gaze, fearing that he would see in my eyes what I was so desperately trying to hide. He got up and came over to me, hugging me and kissing my forehead as he had done so many times before. But this time, it was hard for me to relax. Days passed, but something between us started to change. Jason was attentive, but I increasingly felt distant, lost in my own thoughts. I kept recalling our evening under the stars, Richard's touch, his scent, his voice. At the same time, the guilt kept seeping deeper into my soul, growing sharper with each passing day. While I was cooking dinner or washing dishes, I caught myself thinking about him. When I talked to Jason, I sometimes suddenly realized that I wasn't hearing what he was saying. My attention seemed to drift elsewhere. One evening, when he, slightly frowning, asked, "Amanda, are you okay? You seem so pensive lately." I tried to hide the panic that swept through my body. "Yes, everything's fine," I replied, trying to smile. "Just a lot of work, you know how it is." He nodded, but I saw the shadow of doubt in his eyes. He had clearly started to notice that I was different, more withdrawn, less talkative, less present. It was unbearable to see the worry appear in his gaze, to feel him losing me without even understanding why. At the same time, I knew I couldn't stop meeting Richard. He had become more than just a boss or a colleague to me. His presence filled my life with new colors, made me feel alive, real. I craved these meetings, even though I knew they were destroying everything I had. Each meeting with Richard was filled with energy, passion, and despite my guilt, I could not give him up. He was my refuge, my escape from the grayness that had suddenly taken over my life. I couldn't resist the desire to see him, hear his voice, feel his touch. And with each time, it became harder for me to return to my usual life, to my marriage, which felt increasingly distant and alien. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, Jason spoke again. Are you really okay, Amanda? His voice was soft, but I felt a hint of concern in it. I looked at him, not knowing what to say. How could I explain to him what was happening inside me? How could I confess that I had betrayed him, and at the same time, wanted it? I remained silent, unable to find the right words. I just, I don't know, I finally exhaled. I feel like I've lost myself a little. His face softened, and he took my hand. We all get lost sometimes, he said quietly. But you should know that I am always here, right beside you. These words only intensified my sense of guilt. I felt the contradiction tearing me apart inside. I loved Jason. I loved his calmness, his devotion, his faith in me. But next to him, I felt as if I were in a cage I had locked myself into. And Richard, he was the one who had set me free. I was torn between my duty to my family and the passion that seized me more and more each day. With each passing day, I realized that I was diving deeper into this forbidden romance, and there seemed to be no way out anymore. Returning to work turned out to be a real ordeal for me. The entire office seemed different, even though at first glance, everything was as usual. Colleagues at their desks, ringing phones, and the flickering light of monitors. But inside, everything was different. I could no longer cope with what was happening between Richard and me. The feeling of guilt and the desire I couldn't resist were tearing me apart. As I entered the office, my eyes immediately sought him out. Richard stood by the window of his office, thoughtfully gazing at the cityscape as if trying to find answers to his questions within it. His figure was calm, but I knew that inside him, as within me, there was a storm raging. I took a deep breath, gathering my strength, and resolutely headed toward his office. When I approached, he turned and looked at me, his eyes seeming to see through my thoughts. There was a mix of understanding and pain in his gaze. He clearly knew I hadn't come to discuss just another work matter. "We need to talk," I said quietly, feeling my voice tremble. He nodded and gestured for me to sit down. I closed the door behind me, feeling the tension filling the room. We both remained silent for several seconds, which felt like an eternity. I fought the urge to run away, but knew I had to take this step. "Richard," I began, looking into his eyes, which were full of anticipation. "I can't go on like this anymore. All of this. What's happening between us? I don't know how to handle it. I feel torn apart." He listened to me attentively, without interrupting. His face was serious, but his eyes reflected gentleness and care. "I know, Amanda," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "And I feel the same way. But we have to be honest with each other and figure out what we really want." I was silent, feeling my eyes fill with tears. I didn't know what to say. Everything inside me was screaming with contradictions, the duty to my family and the irresistible passion for the man who had changed my life. I I just don't know," I exhaled, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. "I'm confused, Richard. I don't want to lose you, but I can't continue like this either." He leaned forward, his face coming closer. I could feel his breath, his presence, his warmth. He was near and yet so far away. "Amanda," he said softly, looking straight into my eyes. "You mean a lot to me, but I don't want to be the cause of your pain. I want you to think about what you truly want." His words were simple, but behind them lay so many emotions, so many feelings. I realized that he wasn't just thinking about me, but also about what would come next. What would happen to us, to our lives? I stood up, feeling my legs giving way beneath me. I needed to leave, to be alone with myself. I could no longer bear this tension. "I'll think about it," I said quietly, and trying not to meet his eyes, left the office, leaving Richard deep in thought. I walked down the hallway, and my mind was in chaos. I didn't know the right thing to do. The next day, it was a cool evening as I walked along the waterfront, staying in the shadows of the trees. My steps were light and quick, but my heart was pounding heavily in my chest. I could feel the cold wind sneaking under my coat, but my soul was burning with doubts and questions that needed answers. We had agreed to meet in a quiet, secluded place, a small park by the water, where you rarely saw anyone in the evenings. Richard was already waiting for me. He stood at the very edge of the pier, gazing at the dark waves gently lapping at the shore. His posture was tense, but as soon as he saw me, his face softened, and he smiled. I came closer, feeling the storm of emotions still raging inside me. My body was filled with excitement and fear, and one question pulsed in my mind. How long can I live like this? I could no longer ignore what was happening between us. I needed to know what would come next. "Thank you for coming," I said, trying to speak confidently, though my voice trembled slightly. "I will always come when you ask," Richard replied softly, his gaze focused on my face. We fell silent for a moment, and I gathered all my strength to ask the question that had been troubling me since we left his office. "Richard," I began, feeling the air grow denser around us. "I need to know, is this truly serious for you? Or are we just playing with fire?" He looked at me intently, as if weighing every word. Then he took a step closer, and I felt my heart stop in anticipation of his answer. "Amanda," he began, his voice low and deep, with no hint of humor or hesitation. "I don't want to play with you. This is all too real for me. Every time I see you, I realize I want to be with you. Not just now, not for a while, but always." His words hit me like a bolt from the blue. I felt goosebumps run down my skin. It was a confession I had both feared and longed to hear. "You mean—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The words stuck in my throat. Richard came even closer and took my hands in his. His touch was warm and assured, just like his voice. "Yes, Amanda," he answered, not breaking eye contact. "I love you. I want to spend my entire life with you. I want a future with you." I felt my eyes fill with tears. I hadn't expected such an open confession. All this time, I had been struggling with my feelings, trying to find the right decision. And now, here stood a man willing to change everything for me. I didn't know how to react. My soul was torn between the desire to accept his words and the fear of what might happen next. "But how can we be sure?" I finally asked, feeling tears start to stream down my cheeks. "How can you be sure this is right?" He ran a finger along my face, wiping away the tears, and quietly said, "I can't promise it will be easy, but I know I want to try. I know I want to be with you, no matter what." I stood there, feeling his warmth, his hands holding me tightly as if he was afraid I would leave. In his eyes, I saw the same confidence that had drawn me to him from the beginning, but now there was something new in them: sincerity, a desire not just to be near me, but to build something greater. "I want that too," I whispered, surprised at my own words. "But it's so scary, Richard. I'm afraid I'll ruin everything." He leaned in closer and whispered, "All we need is to be honest with each other and move forward, together." I nodded, feeling the tears flow even more, but this time there was more relief in them than pain. I understood that I was standing at the threshold of a new path, and that path was full of uncertainty. But beside me was a man who was ready to take that step with me. And that gave me strength. Days had passed since my meeting with Richard, but they stretched on like an eternity. Every day, I tried to act as if everything was normal, but every word, every gesture felt like a struggle. I could no longer live with this lie. I felt that I had to confess to Jason, or it would tear me apart from the inside. Yet the fear of the consequences of this truth paralyzed me. I was terrified of seeing the pain in his eyes, of hearing the disappointment in his voice. But something inside was pushing me, compelling me to take this step. One evening, after a hard day, I realized I could no longer delay. We were sitting at dinner in a silence that was heavier than any words. I felt Jason watching me warily, as if he already suspected something was happening, but was afraid to ask. I didn't know how to start this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. I took a deep breath and looked him in the eyes. "Jason," I said, feeling everything tighten inside me with fear. "We need to talk." He looked up, and I saw apprehension and worry in his eyes. "About what?" he asked, though I knew he already sensed what was coming next. I felt my heart start to race, and a chill ran down my spine. I knew I could not delay any longer. "I have been seeing someone else," I blurted out, trying not to avert my gaze. "I can't live like this anymore. We can't be together anymore." The words burst out of my mouth like a bolt from the blue. The room was filled with a silence so loud I could hear my own breathing echo. Jason froze at first, as if paralyzed. Then he suddenly stood up, knocking over his chair, his face contorted with rage and pain. "What did you say?" His voice trembled, and I could see his hands clenching into fists. "Are you mocking me?" "Jason," I began, but he interrupted me, his voice growing louder, almost a shout. "Are you serious? Is this true? You cheated on me?" I nodded, and it felt like a betrayal of everything we had. Tears started rolling down my cheeks, and I could no longer hold them back. His face twisted with pain and disbelief. "How could you?" he shouted, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Who is it? Who have you been with all this time?" "It doesn't matter." I tried to keep my voice steady, but it wavered. "It's not his fault. It's me. I fell in love." "In love?" Jason grabbed his head, as if trying to comprehend what he had just heard. "How could you do this to me? To us? Who is this person?" "I won't tell you," I replied, looking him straight in the eyes. "It doesn't matter. It won't change what happened." He stepped closer, his eyes flashing with fury. "It doesn't matter?" he almost shouted. "You destroyed everything. Our family, our plans, everything. And you say it doesn't matter?" I felt my strength leaving me, the words becoming harder and harder to say. "I can't do this anymore, Jason," I said, barely holding back my tears. "I'm sorry, truly, but I can't live a lie any longer." His face turned pale, like a man who had just received a fatal blow. He looked at me, disbelief in his eyes, then gritted his teeth. "Get out!" he growled, and I saw his eyes fill with tears of anger. "Get out of my house. I never want to see you again." I nodded, realizing there was no point in arguing or trying to convince him otherwise. I went to the bedroom, packed my things into a bag, trying not to think about the future or what would come next. My heart was breaking with pain, but I knew this was my choice, and I had to accept the consequences. When I stepped into the hallway, he stood there, his shoulders trembling with restrained anger. I paused for a moment, hoping he would say something else, give me a sign that there was still a way out of this situation, but he remained silent. "Goodbye, Jason," I whispered before stepping out the door. The door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang, and I felt the world around me collapse. I was left alone, without a home, without a husband, with a sense of guilt and the heartbreaking realization that my life would never be the same again. Tears were still glistening in my eyes as I got into the car. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it would burst at any moment. I looked at the familiar house, which now felt like a stranger's, and felt a wave of fear and uncertainty wash over me. Everything that had been my normal world had collapsed in just a few minutes. I took a deep breath and decided I needed to go to Richard. A swarm of thoughts buzzed in my head, but I knew one thing. I had to tell him everything right now. We were free, and now a new future was opening up before us. A future I had been too afraid even to imagine. I started the car and headed towards his apartment, feeling the tension in my chest ease a little with each passing mile. By the time I reached Richard's building, it was already dark. I climbed the steps, barely feeling my legs, and when I reached his door, I knocked as decisively as I could. A moment later, the door opened, and I saw his face illuminated by the soft light from inside the apartment. He looked at me with mild surprise, but as soon as he saw my face, his eyes became serious. Amanda? What's happened? His voice was filled with concern. I stepped inside, trying to gather my thoughts, and closed the door behind me. I still couldn't calm down after the conversation with Jason, but I had to tell Richard. I told Jason everything, I said, trying to speak with confidence. I told him that I'm having an affair with you, and that we can no longer be together. For a moment, Richard froze, his eyes widened with surprise. But then he stepped towards me, his hands gently touching my shoulders. Did you really tell him? He whispered, as if he couldn't believe his ears. Yes, I nodded, feeling my throat tighten with emotion. It was hard, but I couldn't live like this any longer. Now we are free. We can be together without hiding. Richard looked into my eyes, and his face lit up with a smile I had rarely seen. There was joy in his eyes, almost a childlike wonder. He suddenly pulled me close and hugged me so tightly that I felt my body relax, and a smile spread across my lips, too. I'm so happy, Amanda. His voice was full of emotion. You have no idea how long I've waited for this moment. Now we can start fresh. Together. I felt his heart beating next to mine. In that moment, all the doubts, all the pain that had accompanied me these past days, faded into the background. I was next to the person my heart had chosen, and that gave me the strength to move forward. Richard let go of me for a second to look into my eyes. His face was glowing with happiness, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a genuine sense of ease. We can be together, he repeated, as if not believing his own happiness. Finally? Yes, I smiled, feeling my cheeks flush from his words. I want that too. Now we have all the time in the world to be together, to build our relationship without fears and secrets. He leaned in to kiss me, and at that moment, I realized that everything we had been through was for this feeling of freedom, for the chance to be yourself with someone who truly loves you. We sat together on his couch, and I told him about the conversation with Jason, about his reaction, about my fears and doubts. Richard listened without interrupting, holding my hand. And then, when I finished, he hugged me tightly, as if silently saying that I was safe now. Now, everything will be different, he said, his voice sounding confident and firm. We'll start anew, Amanda. I want you to know that I will always be by your side. We'll get through this together. I nodded, feeling his words seep into my very core. For the first time in a long while, I felt calm and confident about the future. Everything was different now. Now we could rebuild our lives, and I knew that with him by my side, I was ready for any changes. As I stood in his apartment, having just told Richard that I had confessed to Jason, I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. His eyes were glowing with joy, and I could feel that joy spreading to me as well. But instead of relaxing, Richard suddenly suggested something that would become the beginning of our new adventure together. I want to give you a gift, he said, smiling his warm, kind smile. I've been thinking about how we can celebrate our new beginning. Why don't we go on a trip? A trip? I asked, feeling a flutter of excitement inside. Where to? To Europe, he replied confidently. Spain, France, somewhere we can be free and happy, far from everything that has been holding us back here. I felt my heart begin to beat faster. The thought of the two of us getting away, escaping all this chaos, and just being together in the most romantic corners of the world filled me with delight. That sounds amazing, I said, smiling. When do we leave? Right now, he winked. I've already planned everything. My heart overflowed with joy. I nodded, and soon we were packing our things to head to the airport. The entire way there, we held hands, not letting go of each other for even a moment. This was our freedom, our new beginning, and I felt as if each moment was filled with something magical. Our plane landed in Barcelona. I had always dreamed of seeing this city with my own eyes. The narrow streets of the Gothic Quarter, the grandeur of Sagrada Familia, the sun reflecting off the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. We spent a few days in this beautiful city, wandering its streets, savoring the taste of tapas, and listening to the sounds of flamenco drifting from local cafes. Richard thoughtfully chose the places we visited. He took me to small galleries where local artists displayed their works. We visited the famous Park Güell, and even spent an evening on the rooftop of an old building, watching the sunset. Every moment spent there seemed unforgettable. We savored every instant, our freedom, each other, and the fact that we could finally be together without looking back at the past. One evening, as the sun was beginning to set, he suggested we rent bicycles and take a ride along the coast. The wind blew through my hair, and the sea reflected the last rays of the sunset. We laughed, talked, and sometimes remained silent, enjoying the feeling of complete harmony. "Are you happy?" he asked, leaning closer to me when we stopped on the shore to watch the sea merge with the sky in a crimson golden glow. "I'm happy," I replied, feeling warmth spread through my heart. "With you, here, now. It's more than I could have ever imagined." His eyes sparkled in the sunset light, and I saw in them a reflection of my own feelings. Richard took another step forward in our journey, offering me even more joy, more adventures, more love. The next day, we went to France. Paris greeted us with a soft autumn morning, the city shrouded in mist, through which the first rays of sunlight barely pierced. I had always dreamed of seeing Paris, and now we were here, together, ready to explore the city of dreams. Richard had booked us a room in a cozy hotel with a view of the Eiffel Tower. The view from the window took my breath away. We spent the whole day walking through the city's streets, holding hands and not hiding our happiness. We visited the Louvre, strolled along the Champs-Élysées, and had dinner in a small café in Montmartre, where music played in the background of lively conversations and laughter. In the evening, Richard took me to the banks of the Seine. We descended to the water, and he suggested we take a walk along the shore. A gentle breeze blew from the river, and the city lights stretched across the water, giving it a magical atmosphere. We talked about our future, about how we wanted to spend our lives, and each of his looks, each touch, seemed filled with the promise of something greater. When we reached the Pont Alexandre III, he suddenly stopped and turned to me, his eyes shining in the light of the night. "Amanda," he began, taking my hands, "I've always dreamed of finding someone I want to spend my whole life with, and from the moment I met you, I knew that person was you." My heart stopped when he got down on one knee, and I saw a small box decorated with golden patterns in his hand. "I don't want to wait any longer. I don't want to waste another minute. Will you be my wife? Will you spend your life with me?" I felt my eyes fill with tears, but they were tears of happiness. Around us, Paris was glowing, as if the city itself was blessing this moment. "Yes," I whispered, unable to hold back my smile. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Richard stood up, smiling, and slipped the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been waiting for this moment. We kissed, and at that instant, the whole world seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us standing on that bridge in the city of love. That evening, we walked around Paris as if we were part of its fairy tale atmosphere, laughing, enjoying every moment, every second of our new life. I felt that this day was the best of my life, the beginning of something incredible, something I had only ever dreamed of before. Our journey marked the beginning of a new chapter, where each day was filled with joy, love, and incredible adventures. I knew that with Richard by my side, I was ready to face any future.